Why did Ruger lead the team to the exact paths written in a decades-old journal? How did he know to avoid the broken ice? The answers seemed simple, until Caleb found a military dog tag in Ruger's gear, matching the tag mentioned by a woman who died in 1982. So now, the real question wasn't about the dog. It was about whether memory, real, emotional, spiritual, can survive beyond a single lifetime. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you. Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The snow fell in thin, diagonal slashes over the white-berried peaks of the Wind River Range in western Wyoming, driven by the February wind that howled like something ancient and unsettled. The expedition team had arrived at the staging site just as the sky turned a cold steel gray, the kind of overcast that made the mountains look as if they were holding their breath. Dr. Andrew Cole stood at the edge of the frozen basin, his boot planted firmly in the crusted snow, his gloved hand tightening around the strap of his satchel. At 58, Andrew had the presence of a man used to silence, with deep-set blue eyes, prematurely silver hair cut short for convenience, and a scholar's gait, slow, observant, inwardly paced. His tweed-lined parka didn't mask the stiffness in his shoulders, a product of decades spent crouched over excavation sites, maps, and skeletal remains in cold climates. A tenured professor of archaeology from the University of Colorado, Andrew was known in the academic world for his quiet resolve and meticulous standards. A man who spoke little but read landscapes like ancient scriptures. This morning, he wasn't reading bones. He was studying a signal, a peculiar anomaly picked up by ground-penetrating radar the week before. A large metallic shape embedded 70 meters beneath glacial ice. It had appeared just north of Alpine Lake, in an area untouched by roads or footpaths, the kind of place only the wind and snow knew well. And it was here that the story began to uncoil. Next to him stood Dr. Sarah Whitmore, tall and rail-thin, with wind-burned cheeks and crow's feet that danced whenever she smiled, though she rarely did, a glaciologist in her early 40s. Sarah had a weather-hardened elegance, long black hair tucked into a fleece-lined beanie, lips that moved fast when she talked science, and a narrow, angular nose that twitched slightly when something felt off. People said Sarah didn't make small talk. She made theories, a woman who'd once lost her husband in a climbing accident on Denali. She'd since adopted solitude as her armor, burying grief beneath equations, ice core samples, and fieldwork. She respected Andrew for not asking unnecessary questions and appreciated how he let her chain smoke alone in the snow after dusk. Her eyes were fixed now on the portable radar tablet glowing in her glove, the scan lines mapping out the glacier's underbelly like veins. Trailing behind them was Ruger, a German shepherd with fur the color of tarnished bronze and eyes as sharp as a winter hawk. At 7 years old, Ruger moved with the precise, silent grace of a seasoned soldier. He had once served in Afghanistan under the 93rd K-9 Tactical Response Unit, trained to detect buried IEDs and tunnel entrances. A scar ran from the top of his right brow to just past his ear, earned during a rescue mission in Kandahar, and though his left leg carried a slight stiffness, it hadn't dulled his focus. Andrew had adopted him 2 years ago after a veteran handler called in a favor. Ruger didn't bark unless he meant it. He didn't follow unless he trusted. And right now, he wasn't moving. The dog stood stiff, hackles raised, his nose twitching violently as they approached the coordinates. His tail, normally a banner of composure, lowered and curled slightly between his legs. Then Without warning, he emitted a low, guttural growl, not aimed at any one thing, but toward the glacier itself. "Something's not right," Sarah said, lowering her tablet. You see that Andrew nodded. "He's reacting to something we can't sense." Ruger backed up 2 steps and refused to advance further. He circled the area once, nose pressed to the snow, then stopped dead still and stared into the white void ahead. Andrew looked at the radar display again. The signal was clearer now. Whatever was down there wasn't just metallic, it was shaped, structured, man-made. He pulled out the laminated satellite overlays and matched the coordinates. There had been rumors, decades ago, of a plane that disappeared around this sector. Christmas Eve, 1981. No wreckage ever found, no black box, just 143 passengers erased. The cold had swallowed it whole. He glanced at Ruger again, whose posture hadn't softened. "We'll set base camp here," Andrew said, 50 meters from the anomaly, while the main team began unloading the modular tents and drilling equipment from the snow crawlers. Far up the ridge above them, hidden behind a scattering of snow-dusted pines, another set of eyes watched the entire scene unfold. Caleb Harmon was 10 years old and had the heart of a hunter, freckle-faced, with a mop of sun-bleached brown hair poking out from under a threadbare hood. He crouched silently beneath a rock outcrop, hugging his knees. His coat was 3 sizes too big, inherited from a donation box at the Wind River Orphanage down in Dubois, and the boots on his feet had holes stuffed with plastic bread bags to keep out the snowmelt. But his eyes, hazel and unreadable, were sharp, absorbing every movement from the camp below. He had been climbing this part of the range for months now, always alone, always searching. His father, Timothy Harmon, had been aboard that missing plane in 1981, flying home after a work trip. Caleb had never met him. His mother died when he was 5, and ever since he'd stumbled across an old newspaper clipping in the orphanage library, he'd become convinced the mountains held the key to his father's vanishing. He didn't trust adults, but when he saw the dog, Regal, alert, different from others, he leaned in closer. Ruger suddenly turned his head, ears stiff, and stared up toward the ridge. Andrew followed the gaze, but saw only trees, Wolf Sarah guessed, possibly. Andrew murmured, or something smarter. The snow began to thicken, wind gaining a teeth-like edge. Andrew signaled to the team. "Let's finish the survey and get inside. We drill tomorrow." As twilight deepened and the camp's thermal lights flickered to life, Caleb quietly retreated into the tree line, leaving no tracks behind. But he knew one thing: he'd be back. The next morning broke in a grim shade of blue-gray, with clouds drifting low and thick like heavy thoughts hanging over the Wind River Range. It was colder than the day before, the kind of cold that burned into the lungs and made conversation unnecessary. Inside the makeshift command tent, the team gathered around the radar monitor, bundled in layers of down and wool, their breaths misting in the dim light. The anomaly was clearer now. Not just a blob of metal beneath the ice, but the distinct, unmistakable curvature of a tail fin, too large to be anything but an aircraft. Dr. Andrew Cole leaned over the screen with his hands braced on the folding table, eyes locked onto the silhouette displayed in luminous green. Behind him, Sarah Whitmore traced the coordinates on her field tablet, her fingers trembling slightly from the cold or anticipation, or perhaps both. The team's drill engineer, Martin Green, took over the briefing, a broad-chested man in his early 50s, with grizzled stubble and permanently calloused hands. Martin spoke with the slow patience of someone who had learned to trust steel more than people. He had worked oil fields in Alaska, glacier studies in Iceland, and once helped extract a Cold War-era spy satellite in Siberia. "We'll set the first borehole here," he said, tapping a specific coordinate near the tail fin, the ice layers thinner, just under 20 meters, if that metal's what we think it is. We should break through to part of the fuselage by midday. As the drilling commenced, Ruger sat on the outskirts of the operation, ears pricked, gaze fixed on a distant snow ridge. He hadn't barked since yesterday, but his body remained taut, alert to a frequency only he seemed to detect. No one disturbed him, not even Sarah, who had learned to read animals better than most humans in the time since her husband's death. She had spent more nights alone in ice than with friends. Silence didn't frighten her anymore, but the way Ruger watched that ridge unsettled her in a way she didn't say aloud. Up above that same ridge, hidden behind a cluster of scrubby pine, Caleb Harmon once again crouched under his oversized coat, hands buried in his sleeves for warmth. His breath came in slow clouds as he watched the team work. But this time, he had crept closer than the day before. The metallic thrum of the drill echoed through the valley like a summons. Something about the sound and the stillness around it drew him in, and before he knew it, his foot slipped on a patch of snow-veiled shale. He tumbled down the short incline with a muted gasp, landing hard and loud enough that Ruger's ears immediately rotated toward him. The German shepherd stood up, hackles briefly raised, and then, without waiting for command, trotted toward the sound. Caleb scrambled to his feet, trying to back away, but it was too late. Ruger stopped just a few feet away and stared, tail lowered, posture tense but not aggressive. He didn't growl, he didn't bark. He simply looked. It was a long, unblinking gaze that pinned Caleb in place as if the dog saw through his coat, his history, and into the hollow ache in his chest. Seconds later, Dr. Andrew Cole came into view, crunching through the snow in measured strides. When his eyes landed on Caleb, they didn't widen in shock, only narrowed in quiet consideration. "You're not from my team," he said simply. Caleb shook his head, clutching his coat tighter. "I didn't steal anything," he said, voice hoarse. "I was just watching." Andrew gave a small nod, then glanced at Ruger, who now sat at Caleb's side as if he'd been there all along. "What's your name?" "Caleb. Last name, Harmon." At that, something shifted behind Andrew's expression. He exhaled slowly and looked up at the mountain ridge beyond. "Harmon," he repeated, more to himself than to the boy. Timothy Harmon was on FL-208. Caleb's eyes darkened. "Guarded now. He was my dad. I never met him." Andrew's voice softened, not with pity, but with understanding. "You came up here alone?" Caleb nodded. "I've done it before." Andrew crouched slightly, not close enough to intimidate, but enough to meet Caleb's eyes on level ground. "It's dangerous out here, so's being forgotten," Caleb replied. And for the first time, Sarah, who had arrived silently behind Andrew, looked at the boy with something like recognition. She had once said something similar, years ago, to a therapist she never visited again. They brought Caleb back to the main camp. There was some internal discussion among the team, but Andrew made the final call. Caleb would stay, under close supervision. They couldn't exactly hike him down the mountain in the middle of the operation, and he clearly wasn't going to leave willingly. Sarah handed him a thermal blanket and a bowl of instant chili. He didn't say thank you, but he ate every bite, and Ruger lay down beside him the entire time, head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded but never asleep. By late afternoon, the drill struck metal. The sound shifted suddenly. from the crunch of ice to a sharp clang that echoed like a bell underwater. The team paused, adrenaline rising in their chests. Andrew moved to the edge of the borehole with Sarah beside him. A long camera probe was lowered through the shaft, the feed appearing grainy and greenish on the screen. At first, there was only more ice, then, suddenly, a curve of silver, dulled and warped by time but unmistakable in its shape, a tail fin, and etched along it in faded blue letters, FL208. Silence spread across the tent like frost. The past had been found. The next hour unfolded like a dream trapped in slow motion. Using thermal microheaters and soft tools, the team began melting down into the fuselage, inch by inch, and as they broke through into a narrow opening, a wave of frigid air burst out, thick with the scent of cold metal and something faintly sweet like plastic, paper, and time. They illuminated the interior. The cabin was astonishingly preserved, seats still in rows, windows coated in fog. A service tray still locked mid-aisle with a plastic cup half fused with its holder. It was Sarah who noticed it first, an open magazine lying across a seat, its page frozen in a flutter. The world outside had moved on, but in here it was still 1981. Ruger didn't enter the cabin. He sat at the opening, ears flat, watching, when Caleb stepped up behind him. The dog rose and gently pressed his body against the boy's leg. Caleb reached down and ran his fingers through Ruger's fur, as if anchoring himself. "This place," Andrew murmured, "is a time capsule." "No," Sarah corrected gently, her breath visible in the dim light. "It's a grave." The wind howled against the reinforced vinyl walls of the command tent as twilight settled over the ice field, casting everything in muted hues of blue and iron. Inside, the team huddled around the artifacts retrieved from the aircraft's first-class cabin, their gloved hands handling time-frozen objects with reverence. A child's doll, the porcelain face cracked but eyes still bright, a locket containing a faded photograph. And then, from beneath a scorched seat cushion wrapped in protective thermal cloth, came a small, water-damaged, leather-bound book, its spine cracked. Pages brittle but mostly intact. The initials HM were barely visible beneath frost scars. Dr. Andrew Cole turned the book gently, fingers tracing the cover as if it might vanish if touched too firmly. "We've got something," he said softly, placing it on the heat plate used to slowly thaw delicate items. The team gathered around. Ruger, as always, sat near Caleb, who clung to the dog's side like a tether to the present. The boy's eyes narrowed on the book, and he said nothing, but something in his breath quickened. Later that evening, inside the reading tent lined with red warming lights, Sarah Whitmore carefully opened the journal while Andrew stood beside her. Sarah had changed little since the previous days, still in her standard Arctic gear, her long black hair now tied in a functional low braid, though streaks of frost clung to its tips. Her movements were more cautious tonight. This wasn't data, it was testimony. They had confirmed the writer, Helen McCrae, aged 31, a nurse from Billings, Montana, according to flight records. She had boarded FL208 after a 3-week relief mission overseas. Her penmanship was cramped and hurried at first, then began to slow over time, as if weariness soaked into the ink itself. December 25th, 1981. "If you can call this light dawn," she wrote, 22 of us survived. Cold is worse than the crash. One man lost 3 fingers already. We're in the first-class cabin, still has some insulation. Captain Matthews is keeping us focused. We only have one emergency radio. It's not working. Someone's whittling sticks into crosses for the ones we lost last night. Each page captured the slow fade of hope, the blurring of days, and something stranger. Reports of movement outside the fuselage, not wolves. She wrote, not bears. There's a dog, big, silent, appears after nightfall. It left a rabbit near the door. I thought I imagined it. But Julie saw it too. It looked straight at us, then vanished. Sarah's breath caught slightly as she read aloud. Andrew crossed his arms, leaning back. That's impossible, he muttered. No dog could survive here for days, let alone return with food. Maybe not, Sarah replied, but she believed it. The entries continued. Over the following week, Helen chronicled the dwindling survivors. Frostbite. Sleep that led to silence. By January 5th, only 12 remained. The dog reappeared, each time leaving behind a small, clean kill. Rabbits, a ptarmigan, once even a fox. It's impossible, Helen wrote. But we are still here. It knows we're suffering. And somehow, it cares. January 8th. Julie didn't wake up. I'm the last woman now. The dog came again. It sat outside for hours and watched. I cried, not from fear, from the fact that something in this world sees me. Even now. Andrew stared at the final entry for a long while after Sarah stopped reading. Ruger was curled at his feet, eyes closed but ears flicking every so often, like he too heard echoes of the past in the canvas walls, in the corner of the tent. Caleb busied himself near a storage crate where Ruger's belongings were kept. His fingers moved idly through the collection, training harness, paw balm, dog tags. Then he paused. Something small and rectangular had fallen from Ruger's worn field pouch. It was a tarnished military K9 ID tag, slightly scratched but still legible. He turned it over and read the number aloud to himself, 93 Alpha 771. The digits meant nothing to him, but something inside pulled him back toward the journal. Quietly, he stepped toward Sarah, who took the tag with gloved fingers and froze. She flipped to the January 2nd entry. Helen had written, "This morning. We saw the dog more clearly. Collar, tag. It came closer than ever before." Matthews tried to read it aloud. I scribbled it as fast as I could, 93A 771. A silence fell over the tent so total that even the wind outside seemed to pause. Andrew's brow furrowed, not in disbelief, but in reluctant awe. "It can't be," he whispered, 43 years ago. "It's not the same dog," Sarah said gently, preempting his doubt. "But it's the same tag, somehow. Ruger has it." Caleb looked up at them both, voice barely audible. "Do you think that dog was real?" Sarah gave the boy a long, measured look, then glanced at Ruger, now lifting his head with ears alert. "It doesn't matter if it was real by logic," she said. "It was real to her and to the people it saved later that night, as the winds picked up and the tents swayed under the weight of snowfall." Andrew sat by the small propane heater in his cabin, flipping again through Helen's last pages. Her final entry read like a farewell to the world, but also a whisper of peace. "I won't be alone when the end comes. That dog, that soul, will be with me." Outside. Ruger stood at the edge of the camp, staring out into the white. Caleb joined him, one hand resting on the dog's back. Together. They watched the ice stretch endlessly toward the ridge. No tracks, no sounds, but in the hush, there was a kind of presence, something unspoken yet deeply felt, and for the first time, Caleb didn't feel like a boy chasing ghosts. He felt found. The sky had opened that morning, crystalline and blue, as if offering a momentary truce to the white-scarred wilderness. The sun, low and lazy behind the peaks, cast long shadows across the encampment, painting the tents with faint orange edges. The cold remained, sharp and ever-present, but less cruel than the days before. Ruger stood by the perimeter, motionless except for his ears, which twitched at intervals, responding to whispers only he could hear. Caleb stood beside him, the boy now wrapped in a new thermal coat donated by the team, still oversized but no longer pitifully so. His cheeks had taken on a healthier tone, and his gaze no longer held that restless vacancy. Since discovering the dog tag in Ruger's pouch and hearing Helen's final entries, Caleb had stopped asking questions aloud. He simply followed. Sarah Whitmore approached from the data tent, a clipboard tucked beneath one arm and her long braid swinging over one shoulder. Despite the harsh sun, she still wore her mirrored snow goggles, part practicality, part distance. She wasn't someone who reached for sentiment easily, but what she'd seen the night before had shaken her in a way no storm ever had. She sat next to Andrew Cole, who was carefully mapping out the cleared portions of the wreckage. "You know what this looks like," Sarah said, tapping the satellite overlay with the tip of her pencil. "These roots, those indentations in the snow and ice. They match the directional references in Helen's diary. Almost exactly." Andrew lifted his gaze. "The rescue paths, survival paths," she corrected. "Where she wrote they found food, where they saw tracks." She glanced toward Ruger. "That dog is walking the same lines." Andrew furrowed his brow. "Ruger wasn't born here. He wasn't trained here." "No," Sarah said quietly, but something in him recognizes the patterns. "I want to show you something." She unzipped a side pocket and pulled out a small drive. Moments later, inside the control trailer, she loaded the footage. The drone's thermal camera showed a high-angle view of the ice field. In the footage, Ruger moved along specific ridgelines and depressions, circling certain glacial clefts and avoiding others entirely. Overlaid on the screen were the hand-drawn sketches from Helen's journal. The paths matched, down to the curve, the loop, the return points. "This isn't coincidence," Sarah said. "This is inherited behavior, or memory, or something else." Andrew leaned forward. "Are you saying he remembers it? Without ever being here, I'm saying." She replied, "He doesn't need to remember it to know it. Something in him knows. Like instinct, amplified by presence, by place." Meanwhile, Caleb had wandered back toward the plane. He hadn't been allowed to enter the fuselage the day before, but Sarah had quietly told him that morning. "If you're careful, go, just don't touch anything." Ruger stayed beside him, stepping over the melted openings with surprising delicacy for such a large dog. The inside of the cabin was unchanged, rows of seats like frozen pews, personal belongings still resting like whispered memories. Caleb moved slowly, respectfully, eyes scanning every seat back tray and overhead bin, unsure what he was looking for until he saw it near the cockpit, half tucked beneath a collapsed seat cushion. Was a photo, creased, damp, but preserved between two laminated pages of a flight manual. Caleb reached for it with gloved fingers and froze. It was a man, standing in a pilot's uniform, smiling beside a snow-dusted car. His name badge read Captain T. Harmon. Caleb stared at the image, his throat tightening, breath catching in shallow pulls. Ruger gently bumped his leg, as if grounding him. The boy dropped to his knees, pressing the photo against his chest. For the first time, he knew, without doubt, that his father had been here, that this place had been real, that the ghost he'd chased wasn't just memory, but flesh and blood. Later that afternoon, Sarah called in a friend via satellite. Dr. Elaine Harrow, a behavioral biologist based in Oregon, known for her unconventional theories about animal cognition, on the video call. Elaine's short silver hair framed her sharp, fox-like face. She wore a green parka even indoors, her personality as brisk as her research style. "You're describing layered trail memory," Elaine said, peering over her glasses. "It's been observed in wolves, occasionally in elephants. The idea that migratory or survival patterns can imprint over generations, not genetically, but through repeated behavior." Sarah leaned in. "But Ruger's not related, he's not native, he's trained, not wild, doesn't matter," Elaine replied. "He's picking up on what I call behavioral resonance, the echo of a repeated act. Left in the environment like a faint song, most animals don't hear it. Some do." Andrew sat in silence. The idea was unprovable, but it explained everything they'd seen. The specific routes, the precise avoidance of danger, the connection between the dog and the site. It's as if he's reading a memory left in the ice. Andrew whispered. Elaine nodded once, exactly that, as the sun began to sink, casting golden amber light across the snow. Caleb sat with Ruger at the edge of the ridge that overlooked the tail section. He held the photo of his father, now sealed in a protective sleeve. Ruger rested his head on the boy's lap, tail occasionally flicking, for the first time. Caleb didn't feel like the orphan left behind. He felt like someone arriving into a story, into a truth, into a legacy he had unknowingly inherited. The past didn't belong to strangers anymore. It belonged to him, too. The storm came without warning. At first, it was a subtle shift, low pressure curling against the sky like breath held too long. The team had monitored the barometric readings, but nothing suggested what would unfold next. By midday, a white curtain fell across the ice field, erasing shadows and lines, muting color and sound. The horizon vanished, swallowed by a swirling wall of frost and wind. Tents snapped in their moorings. Thermal lines crackled, and visibility dropped to less than 3 feet. Inside the reinforced command tent, Dr. Andrew Cole moved with a calm that betrayed urgency. The 58-year-old archaeologist had faced his share of unpredictable environments, but never one so sudden, so sentient. He barked orders with a clarity that made others move faster. Shut down external equipment, reinforce tent stakes, emergency rations, double-check them. His face, weathered and cut with lines like carved granite, remained composed. Only his eyes, flitting every few seconds to the storm flap, betrayed his worry. Sarah Whitmore was already in motion. She zipped up her insulated jumpsuit, her tall frame moving through the corridor like a reed against wind, flexible but unshakable, despite her lean body and bone-deep fatigue. She moved with precision. Loss had taught her the cost of delay. She retrieved Ruger's thermal coat and made her way toward the dog enclosure, only to find the German shepherd already at the tent's entrance, waiting. Ruger was soaked in snow but unbothered, his fur clinging in frozen shards around his chest and tail. His amber eyes met hers, unwavering. Then he turned and growled, not at her, but at the east ridge. The sound was low, vibrating through the floor. Caleb, who had been crouched beside the heater nursing a cracked thermos of cocoa, looked up sharply. He stood and crossed to Sarah. "He doesn't growl like that unless," he began. But Ruger was already gone. Without waiting for permission, the boy grabbed his gloves and ran after the dog into the storm. Andrew followed in a rush of cold air and protest. Caleb's outline disappeared within seconds, swallowed by white. Sarah and Andrew pushed forward, the storm biting into every fold of exposed skin. Ruger's tracks appeared, then vanished beneath layers of falling snow, just when they thought they'd lost him. A bark pierced the wind, sharp, urgent. They found Caleb standing near a steep incline, his coat billowing like a flag. Ruger stood between the boy and a sudden, jagged fracture in the snowpack, a sheer drop that hadn't been visible before. A cornice had collapsed. One step more, and Caleb would have fallen into an ice ravine that stretched who knew how far beneath them. Andrew pulled the boy back. Breath ragged. "You never run in a whiteout," he said sternly. Caleb only nodded. Eyes wide, not with fear, but awe. "He saved me," the boy whispered. Again. The storm lasted 38 hours. When it cleared, it left behind a world transformed. Snow dunes had shifted like desert sands, and even the fuselage of FL-208 appeared changed, half reburied beneath new drifts. The sight felt both cleaner and more sacred, as if the storm had sealed something shut. That afternoon, Andrew called for a moment of silence. A simple slab of stone, carved from a local quarry and flown in by the initial cargo helicopter, was erected at the edge of the ridge, facing the crash site. Chiseled into its surface were the names of the 143 passengers and crew, and beneath them, in smaller letters, "In memory of Helen McCrae," and the silent guardian who stayed. Caleb stood beside Andrew during the ceremony, dressed now in one of Andrew's old fleece-lined parkas, sleeves still a bit too long. Sarah was nearby, her braid tucked neatly under her hood, eyes hidden behind reflective goggles that shimmered with tears she would never admit. Ruger approached the stone. No one instructed him. He carried in his mouth a broken pine sprig, small, green, humble, and placed it gently at the foot of the memorial. Then he sat, facing the slab, unmoving. The team said nothing. Silence was the only appropriate language. Over the next few days, the crew began their withdrawal. Helicopters arrived, lifting equipment and personnel out in rotations. Caleb was meant to return to the orphanage, but no one, not even the director, questioned Andrew's paperwork when he signed guardianship forms. "He's coming home with me," the archaeologist said. "Simple and absolute." Sarah nodded in quiet approval. She had seen too many kids lost to silence. Caleb would not be another. Ruger adapted instantly to the new arrangement. On the last day at base, he circled the site 3 times, pausing at each entrance, each trail, as if checking on the ghosts one final time. Then he returned to Caleb's side and didn't leave it in the weeks that followed. Back in Laramie, Andrew's home transformed. A second bedroom was redecorated with help from Sarah, who surprised herself by shopping for bunk beds and navy bed sheets. Caleb enrolled in school for the first time in years. He struggled at first, but Ruger walked with him to the bus stop each morning and waited each afternoon like a sentinel. And every year after that, on December 24th, they returned to Wind River. The crash site remained protected under federal stewardship, but Andrew was granted permanent access for memorial maintenance each year. Ruger would place a pine sprig at the base of the stone, no matter the snowfall. One year, Caleb, now taller, voice deepened, asked why Ruger did it. Andrew replied, "Some memories don't belong to the past. They live in the blood, in the snow, in silence." And on one particularly quiet night, years later, under a dancing ribbon of aurora across the Alaskan sky, Caleb knelt beside Ruger, hand resting on his back. The dog looked up at him, his muzzle now peppered with gray. Caleb whispered into the frozen stillness, voice carrying only far enough for the dog to hear. we're not alone. Not anymore, sometimes. The miracles we seek don't come with thunder or light, but in the quiet footsteps of a dog who remembers pain not his own, or in the eyes of a child who finds home in the most unexpected place. The story of Ruger, Caleb, and the Souls of FL-208 is not just about survival. It's about the invisible thread of compassion that weaves through time, through silence, through snow. It's a reminder that God works in the stillness, in the wind, in the loyalty of creatures who cannot speak, yet understand. Maybe it wasn't just instinct that led Ruger through those ancient paths. Maybe it was grace. Maybe God sent one guardian decades ago, and another to remind us that no one is ever truly forgotten. In a world that often feels cold and lost, this story is a light reminding us that healing is possible, that faith is real, and that we are never truly alone, even when buried under the weight of grief or silence. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to believe in something greater. Comment below your thoughts or simply write Amen to honor the souls who watched over others. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that show us the power of faith, the strength of animals, and the miracles hidden in everyday moments. May God bless you and guide your steps, even through the deepest snow.